Hey, it's Bill Simmons. Did you know I've had my podcast for 15 years? Do you know that it is the most downloaded sports podcast of all time? Did you know I have guests from the sports world, from the culture world, people who work for The Ringer, people outside The Ringer, celebrities, experts, you name it. It's on my podcast 3 times a week, late Sunday night, late Tuesday night, late Thursday night, the Bill Simmons podcast. Check it out on Spotify. This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day or hiking or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago, and the guy was like, "You're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago." I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details. This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian software like Jira, Confluence, and Trello help power global collaboration for all teams so they can accomplish everything that's impossible alone. Because individually we're great, but together we're so much better. Learn how to unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.com. Atlassian. Tap the banner or visit this episode's page to learn more.
I need support staff to clear the room. Stand up and walk now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ryan. I am an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me on the other line, inspired by true events, it's Andy Greenwald.
God, it would make such a boring TV show. It would make the worst TV show ever. Like do you know anyone who goes through life being like, if only they knew, if only they knew, if only there were cameras? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I don't
have that.
Whether I think that there have been points where I was like, this would when I've been working at Greenwald or The Ringer, where I would be like, this would make a cool newsroom type show. Not that we ever made any massive we didn't break the death of bin Laden or something like that. But you know what I mean? Like, it would have been kind of amusing to have captured some of that stuff on camera. But no, I don't think that my life is at all interesting.
Like the most interesting thing about me is that I say this humbly. I use a different word every day for Wordle depending on my mood, like as a reflection of me. And I think that's fascinating. Like today I used tired because that's how I was feeling. But I think maybe you get 6 eps out of that, like probably Hulu. But beyond that, I wouldn't be so bold as to assume, you know?
So Andy, the reason why we're even making this joke is because part of what we're talking about today is the inspired by true events mania gripping television, the television industry right now. We're in the midst of what's going to look like, I think it's going to be more than half a dozen shows by summer, maybe, of shows that feel ripped from the headlines because they are literally ripped from the headlines, whether they're adapted from long form magazine articles, from podcasts, from just sensational documentaries, what have you. And, a couple weeks ago, Inventing Anna came out on Netflix. It was Shonda Rhimes' show starring Julia Garner and Anna Chomsky about the Anna Delvey / Sorokin controversy that was documented by Jessica Pressler in New York Magazine. We have this weekend, I believe, is the premiere of Super Pumped, which is the new show from Brian Koppelman and David Levine about the rise and fall of Travis Kalanick at Uber. And in coming weeks, we have We Crashed, which is a show about WeWork starring Jared Leto and Anne Hathaway. We have Joe versus Carol, which is the Peacock adaptation or riff on characters from Tiger King. We have, I try to wrap The Dropout, Amanda Seyfried's starring as Elizabeth Holmes. I almost said Lizzie Holmes, like we're just like buds. Hey, Chris, it's Elizabeth Holmes. No? You like my Elizabeth Holmes voice?
I got to watch it in real time. I actually don't have a response.
So we have a lot of these shows coming out. I think that you and I have discussed this, talked around this topic a little bit, but I thought we could get into that today. Before we do, Andy, is there anything you wanted to just get off your chest culturally?
Well, culturally, no. I do think this is ripped from the headlines. I just want to use our podcast real estate to just put a couple flyers down or a couple, those like real estate stakes signs in the yard to say that you've been spreading the seed far and wide on the podcast front recently.
Mean?
Well, I feel like people should know you just did a long interview on the dude from Touche Amore's podcast.
Jeremy Boehm's podcast.
A great band that you and I both like. And
it's called First Ever Podcast.
And you're the guest talking about your hardcore history, which I love. Yeah.
Well, it was like, it's like a wide ranging conversation, but I did talk a little bit about like growing up in Philly and living in Boston and moving to New York and music and stuff like that. It was awesome to do it.
I think fans should check that out. I also need to ask you on the mic about this 5-hour podcast you did about Pavement.
Yeah.
Which is amazing because I think in many ways our life together has been leading to this moment. I think that across the bars, saloons, and taverns of Lower Manhattan, you and I did many 5-hour podcasts about Pavement, even if they weren't about Pavement. So how did this happen that you actually had a professional opportunity to do so?
I was asked to appear on Bandsplain by Yasi to talk about Pavement. She does these really extensive, exhaustive surveys of these, I would say oft discussed bands, but basically it's like, these deep dives into whether it's Weezer or Fugazi. She just put one up with Jeff Weiss about Sublime, but they are really like long form discussions about the entire history of a band. And then, they interpolate the songs that you're talking about. So like when we were talking about Pavement, you can go through and it is a very long conversation, but a chunk of that runtime is dedicated to about 10 to 15 to 20 Pavement songs throughout the podcast.
That's amazing. I love this. I support it. Last thing from the Transom Wire, Chris. I want to give you the opportunity on the Watch podcast to zag when others have zigged. I was wondering if you wanted to take the opportunity to just, stake out a unique position in the Oscar blogosphere and be like, fuck short form documentaries.
No, why don't you do that? Because I
want no editors on
television.
You're
asking me to do what you're bidding. I know that I can see the twinkle in your eye.
No, I disagree.
That animated short will no longer be clogging up your Oscar broadcast.
Animated short, words to be used to describe you in New York in the early 2000s as well. No, I mean, so this is just referring to the latest news that in its increasing, it's never ending efforts to fix the wrong problems. The Oscars announced that hosts Wanda Sykes, Amy Schumer, and Regina Hall will not have to navigate the choppy waters of giving awards to film artisans who aren't famous. And they will not give certain, I don't know. I mean, I'm not even going to say less than big ticket awards. They're all going to be shunted to the pre-ceremony or whatever, which is what the Grammys.
I think there will also be some that are given away during commercial breaks, and it's going to be like, just so you know, like this guy just won. His dream came true. Like,
it's pretty wild. I mean, I actually don't have anything new to add to it.
Do you think that
honestly curious.
Is the point of this to shorten the broadcast, or I mean, what is the? Are they trying to optimize it?
I don't know, and I should say, like our pal Sean Fennessy is always very smart and very eloquent about these things in various media, whether it's his podcast, Bill's podcast, or on Twitter. Bill Gilberry from Vulture, New York Magazine, wrote a really smart piece today that I thought really just distilled it, which is just like, stop fucking up. Like,
right.
There is no human alive who's like, well, the Oscars are only 2 hours and 59 minutes. I will watch. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
There's no one, you're not going to make people happy if you take things away from like editors and Drive My Car and let Twitter say Spider-Man was good. Like they're rearranging deck chairs on popular Best Picture winner Titanic. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't make any sense, instead of just owning the reality of it, that the Oscars are a popular show, slightly less popular in contemporary times. But no, but I genuinely do feel bummed out about it, because part of the fun of the Oscars is seeing people who are truly happy and not used to performing happiness in public.
Yeah, you get those kind of charming moments of folks that are like, I get to, maybe that's not what they're thinking, but they're like, I'm standing here, I look out, I see Meryl Streep and Brad Pitt and Denzel Washington. This is a pretty amazing moment. I made this short film. And I think that a lot of Academy voters take their responsibilities pretty seriously and consider a lot of this stuff. So it's sort of strange to just kind of, I get it. Like, I think that I've just gotten out on the other side of a lot of NBA concern trolling about like what's wrong with All-Star Weekend, like what happened to Saturday Night All-Star, like, and everything. And just basically like, you know, a lot of like, how could we make this more efficient? How could we make it more popular? The NBA All-Star game, I think, had like 6 million viewers. It's down from, I don't know, like 20 or 30 million people watching it at the height of Jordan, you know, in the 90s. I don't know how to there's no magic words to say to make these things more important than they are in society or in culture right now.
Yeah, well, I also don't know. Has the question, how do we make this more popular, ever had a good or satisfying answer, let alone a successful answer?
Yeah, but I you know, it's funny because like we'll do rewatchables or we'll do episodes of The Big Picture where we go back and we're talking about movies from 1994 or something like that.
Right.
And you go through the Oscars from that year. And I think in my mind, I'm just like every single year, it was just like Tom Hanks and Kevin Costner and, you know, like Steven Spielberg and Jack Nicholson was there. And in my mind, I think, but then when you like look at the actual movies that were nominated, there were small movies. There were movies that have never been thought of again since that night. There are performances that were like, how the hell did this person get nominated over X, Y, or Z? There were plenty of moments about it. I just think we had less to do and watch back then. And people just have way more choice now. And the Oscars is increasingly becoming something that like, I just don't know if it matters to a large swath of the general public. I don't know how taking away these genuinely like moving moments of like people getting an opportunity to be celebrated by their industry is really the answer to get what, like 1 million more people to tune in.
Yeah. I also think that it's just not really reading the temperature of the culture, which absolutely is saying one thing loud and clear, which is that major adult themed motion pictures are no longer at the center of the culture or the national conversation. Right. And that's raging against the dying of the light, man. But that light is dim. That happened. Just ask my homies in string quartets, you know, like once that switches, it doesn't come back.
Is it the string quartet that was on the Titanic that you're referring to? Or is this just in general, like
R.I.P. Sebastian, Gustav, you guys played your hearts out. Yeah. But the other thing, the cross current that I just think is worth mentioning is that while the unifying monocultural juggernaut of a film such as the ones that Tom Hanks was in the 90s, that may have diminished. One thing that has absolutely, unquestionably increased, I think, is the casual audience's interest in how things get made and what people's jobs are and all of the stories behind the scenes. I mean, I've been seeing the absolute media blitz this week of Kyle Buchanan's book about the making of Mad Max Fury Road, which is a worthwhile film with a lot of good stories and was a popular film. But also, it's a book about the fourth Mad Max movie. You know what I mean? Like my first thought was like, this isn't going to rock the world, but people are fascinated to hear this stuff. And I think that, 20 plus years of internet culture has also taught us that like people want to talk about the minutia of things. And so... And even with a much more somber and serious note, like the passing of Helena Hutchinson on the set of Rust, like people are aware of the jobs that crews do and the circumstances in which they do them. And so removing them from the conversation just to focus on, hoping against hope that Will Smith wins Best Actor and like gives a good speech, that's just bizarre to me.
There's always been this thing. I think I actually feel this way a lot about movie trailers too, and I'm kind of trying to articulate this as I go along, so people have to forgive me if this sounds a little bit muddled. But
Kaya, if it's muddled, just put Pavement songs in. Stretch it.
You know how like when you watch a trailer for a blockbuster, and then when you see the movie, you're like, oh, a lot of what. Well, the trailer just basically told the story of the movie. There are not that many extra dramatic beats that weren't covered in the trailer. In fact, it gave away some of the most exciting, thrilling moments that would have been so much more overwhelming had I not known they were coming. And because this movie is named Blockbuster X, Y, or Z, I was going to see it anyway.
Yeah.
Like the only thing that would have deterred me from seeing it is if people were like, this is unmitigated garbage. But for the most part, like as somebody who likes going to the movies and as somebody who wants to sort of see the biggest movies in the theaters, I'll probably go see it, whether it's the Batman, whether it's whatever. And so what I always wonder is when you're making these trailers is who are you selling this to? Like who needs like, haven't you already gotten this person's money? Aren't you just diminishing the experience? So my point about this connected to the Oscars is like, if I'm watching the Oscars, I'm watching the Oscars. Like you don't need to make the Oscars shorter or less focused on celebrating movie making. Like it's fine. Like, you've got my money. I understand, like, would the word of mouth be worse if, like, the Oscars was 3 hours and 20 minutes long and there was some weird speech in the middle of it for best documentary short and people like tuned out or whatever? No, that's not what happens. Like, what happens is it gets lost in kind of like these weird tributes, or there's musical numbers that nobody likes, or people just get like realize that that's a really long time to be sitting in front of your television eating chips and drinking beer, and you sort of get tired. And then once you finally get to Best Picture, sometimes it can feel anticlimactic. But you don't need to like tweak the Oscars in that way, because people are already here for the Oscars.
Yeah, I don't understand why the Oscars is addicted to making itself smaller. Like, I don't get it. Like, not just in terms of length, because, yeah, I as people who have listened to me for a long time know, like, I am all for the removal of movie montages about how we like movies when you're watching a show that is literally about movies. Like that, we get that message. I'm good with that. But I think the last 2 years, I mean, when the story of this era is written, potentially in Cyrillic, like, people will look back on these last 2 years.
Holy shit.
And there are many reasons why ratings of big events took a dive, right? Whether it's the pandemic was affecting audiences or affecting the ability to put on the show or people's willingness to go to the show, without question. But last year, I get the intention of Steven Soderbergh being like, we're going to throw a clubby, chummy, Ocean's 11 type Hollywood vibe in the train station, and it's going to be kind of a show for the industry, for the people who have been either vetted, tested, and screened to be in the room. But it felt very claustrophobic and closed off. It did not feel welcoming. It did not feel like any kind of party that anyone would want to be invited to. And then again this year, and I mean no disrespect to the three very talented women who are hosting the show, but the Oscars aren't necessarily going to live or die on the most famous person in the world winning an award or the most famous person in the world hosting. You need smart, funny, engaged stars in the room, and you need it to be a big room. You know what I mean? And it needs to fill the room. And I get that, like, whether Don't Look Up should have been nominated or not is not what I'm arguing right now, but you nominated it. And so, like, DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence are going to be there.
Yeah.
They're big stars. They're going to be there. So I think you just have to build outward from that. It's very strange, this sort of weird, like, aw shucks humility. Like, we're just going to keep trying to, pivot to TikTok or whatever. It's all very poochy, and I don't understand it. I just don't understand it, because the people for whom you're alienating the people to whom it matters. And once you lose them, what do you got left?
There was one other bit of entertainment news that I wanted to hit before we get into the meat of the show. And that was this story that came out, I believe, in the Hollywood Reporter. I think maybe people may have seen 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago. It was announced that Paramount would be making a fourth Star Wars film with the right. Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto axis of characters. Or cast members. And it was long been rumored that maybe they would bring Chris Hemsworth back, and it would be like kind of a time travel story. Or there was also this much bandied about Quentin Tarantino story idea that Mark L. Smith, who did The Revenant, was writing. And Noah Hawley. Noah Hawley also had something going. But that doesn't sound like what they arrived at. Like, I don't know who's writing it, but Matt Shakman, who directed WandaVision, would be directing this new film. And then this week, it was announced that, or it was reported that the cast of Star Trek was not aware of this development. Like that I think it was more that, like, the paperwork was not dry yet, but the way it was reported made it basically sound like this came as a shock to them. I don't necessarily want to debate, like, whether or not, like, Star Trek should or shouldn't come back, or whether these people did or didn't know. But what do you think would be the worst news to find out that you were in a new sequel? Like, what do you think would be like, oh no, they're bringing me back for this? Because this has to happen sometimes when people sign up for like 9 movie deals.
Right. Oh, because the idea, the assumption, right, is that, like, they're already under contract for it. They just didn't know. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they had, like, options that needed to be exercised. I have no idea. But, like, I was really just thinking about, like, what would it feel like while Adam Driver's on the set of Noah Baumbach's White Noise and he gets the Kylo Ren call?
I feel like the worst scenario here would be Terry Kaiser at age 83 being told they're making Weekend at Bernie's 3. You know what I mean? It's just like...
Is Terry Kaiser still with us?
He is still with us. He's 82, 83 years young. I just feel like that might be pushing it a little bit.
Silverman and McCarthy, they're still cracking.
It's the Star Trek thing remains one of the weirdest cultural stories for me. I mean, I know, Chris, you love to call out your guy Bob Backish, the head of Paramount. Like he was always your dark horse Bob in Hollywood's Bob Wars. I feel like you were always bullish.
Backish. Yeah,
you were bullish on Backish, and when you pull back from a macro level, he's done very well in the position that he's been in, particularly in terms of redefining what had once been a almost like Hydra-like media company, Viacom, CBS, and Paramount into. Now it's all Paramount. They're rebranding everything. And to do so, really attempting to double or triple or quadruple down on franchises and stars, right? Like even those Paramount Plus ads where it's just like famous people and football players on a mountain.
Bryson DeChambeau, Gail King, and Christine Baranski are in the
two
snow.
of the 6 members of Paw Patrol.
Yeah.
That's been smart for them. And when I was actually having this conversation with someone the other day, it was like, well, wait, what is Paramount Plus? And I was like, well, it's mostly an assortment of Taylor Sheridan shows and Star Trek shows and Paw Patrol. And it's successful. Like you can define it, and that's not necessarily the case with Peacock, for example. Yet my show's on there, and there are other good shows on there, but it's not as easily defined. All this is to say, being like Star Trek's something we control, so we're just going to flood the zone with it because they're Star Trek fans. All that makes sense. But then when that very smart business theory meets the smart business rubber meets the creative road of like, now someone has to call Zoe Saldana and be like, you better suit up. This is Matt Jackman. Like, nice to meet you. You're doing makeup in 3. Like that's when it starts to get a little odd because those movies were pretty good. Chris Pine and Quinto are really good, but I don't have my finger on the pulse of the national mood. But are people just like, I need to know what alt universe Kirk and Spock are up to? I need to know.
I really don't know. I think Star Trek obviously has like a really, really strong base of fans. And I think that it's never actually exactly been my jam, but I do respect the fact that there are certain like tenets of belief about like the way the galaxy that Star Trek occupies should operate and like what the sort of value system of these stories should be, which I've always kind of appreciated. It's like a lot of the times these stories are dictated by very rigid like plot lines, like whether it's like the sanctity of Skywalkers or like how the King's Landing or how the Seven Kingdoms need to operate given like the quote unquote history of the land or whatever. And it turns out like adhering to that stuff actually is pretty smart because it makes a good show. When you break away from it, it's tough. But I've always kind of appreciated Star Trek's kind of like, it's more about, we love to explore,
But Chris, here's the weird moment we're in. Star Trek is a TV show. Star Wars were movies. That was always the thing. Yeah. And that was both, that helped them and it hindered them. And the struggle that Star Trek went through over the 20 years from like 95 to 2015 was as everything moved towards blockbusters, but particularly blockbuster films, continuing Star Trek into a place where the stakes were movie-sized and it was all one story, and the way everything was becoming, in terms of comic book entertainment was a struggle. And ultimately the brilliant thing that J.J. Abrams did, and this is up there, I think, with his like top 5 most, clever / devious Hollywood proclamations was, we're just going to reboot the original ones because that's what people like, but we'll give them different stakes this time. And that was really, really smart. But now in 2022, everything is TV. So you have a leg up. You actually can just have people explore and wander around. And they are doing that on their, varying suite of shows, some of which are more successful or more beloved than others. And you have Star Wars on the back foot, not necessarily in terms of the money put behind it or the fandom, but struggling to adjust to a different kind of storytelling structure. And yet that's the thing that kind of flummoxes me about Star Trek's moment, because now they're trying to continue the feature franchise when it doesn't really make that much sense. But even their TV offerings like Picard, which I was on board to watch because I would watch Patrick Stewart wandering around space / also maybe a vineyard sometimes, because those were low-key the best episodes. But the episodes I saw were too stakesy. Yeah. It was just like one last chance to save Data, who is a robot, but it now clearly looks 70 years old.
He's also a sommelier. Yeah.
But let's also move on. just make the show about them wandering around and having adventures. But that's not the culture. It's weird. It's like it keeps kind of missing its moment.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. New Year's resolutions are fun the first couple of weeks. Then you kind of maybe conveniently forget about them halfway through January. No shame. It happens to us all. But this year I have a foolproof plan, at least when it comes to saving money. Just switch to Mint Mobile and you're done. Goal accomplished, because for a limited time, their wireless plans are $15 a month when you buy a 3-month plan. The great thing about Mint Mobile is there's no jaw-dropping monthly bills or unexpected overages, and all plans come with unlimited talk and text. Get this new customer offer today at mintmobile.com/watch. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You might say all kinds of stuff when things go wrong, but these are the words you really need to remember. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. They've got options to fit your unique insurance needs, meaning you can talk to your agent to choose the coverage you need, have coverage options to protect the things you value most, file a claim right on the State Farm mobile app, and even reach a real person when you need to talk to someone. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
I've got kids, and that means it's always about them. But I need support too. That's where Ollie comes in, with their delightful, hardworking gummies. My partner and I can actually get a good night's sleep, so we'll both stand a chance of managing our stress responses. Even when the kids are doing parkour in the living room. Discover Ollie vitamins and supplements. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Love the way you look this wedding season at Men's Warehouse. With a range of sizes from extra small to big and tall. Explore top styles at prices for any budget, including designer suit and tux rentals starting at just $159. With over 600 locations, in-store consultations, and easy online booking, there's a reason why couples choose Men's Warehouse to find their perfect fit. Men's Warehouse. Love the way you look.
Okay, so let's talk about what is the culture right now, whether we like it or not, which is these this rash of shows that are, for lack of a better term, inspired by true events, like we were talking about earlier. I want to shout out Sean Fennessy, who texted me the other night and was just like, this would be a good topic for you and Andy to discuss, this sort of inspired by true events.
Wow, look at him, the Jerry Jones of the podcast, telling us who to play and what offense to run. Wow.
Yeah. Sean has been paying Kaya not to take a job with the Miami Dolphins so that she can at any point step in here if one of us falters. We had a funny conversation last night because we were kind of going through all these series, and Andy and I will probably talk a little bit more in depth about Inventing Anna than others. Although I will say I've seen episodes of Super Pumped, and I personally enjoy it quite a bit because I really enjoy the Koppelman-Levine rat-a-tat-tat dialogue. But I think some of the things that we'll say about these shows apply to Super Pumped as well. And Sean basically asked me the question, has there been a good one of these shows since OJ? Since the Ryan Murphy OJ series that maybe kickstarted this entire wave in the first place.
And that doesn't have 100% approval rating.
Not even on this podcast. So I would say that's a good point. And we kind of went back and forth about it, and I just want to sort of out my own biases right now.
Sure.
Because I said to him, like, we were going back and forth about these shows, and then I was like, this, however, is extremely my shit. And I sent him the trailer for Under the Banner of Heaven, which is coming out shortly, pretty soon on FX, and stars Andrew Garfield, and it's an adaptation of the Jon Krakauer true crime book. And that the first thing you see in that trailer is inspired by, true events and Jon Krakauer's true crime bestseller. And I was like, maybe I'm a hypocrite. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just like, I don't care whether it's ripped from the headlines. I just want the headlines to be the kinds of stories I want to see told over and over again.
Well, I think there's a couple different, under the larger banner of your thesis, in addition to Heaven, I think there's a couple smaller threads to unpack. One is, the story industry has never been more optimized or weaponized, which is to say that Hollywood has always been in the business of scouring obsessively every article published in every magazine and every book to, as grist for the content mill. That is nothing new. But the degree to which it is all optimized now is different. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not ascribing any bad motives or saying any of this is cynical. It's actually very smart that companies like Gimlet, which is now, I believe, also owned by Spotify, or Wondery, who have made successful podcasts, have now gotten to the business of being producers themselves, right? And controlling, or at least attempting to be more involved in and control their properties all the way through, which is just smart business. Because if you are a struggling public radio station or magazine or journal or whatever, you don't want to get the one-time option payout to give your thing away that could actually make you enough money to continue to publish or exist. You want to be a part of it all the way through. So, but there are also other, there are other entities like Epic Magazine, which publishes really good journalism and then also sells them to Hollywood, and they turn into shows like Little America or things like that. The pipeline is fast moving and constant. A lot of that also plays into the fearfulness of Hollywood at the moment, right? Which is that if any aspect of something is familiar, they're more comfortable greenlighting it because people are worried about their jobs. And it used to be if the star is familiar or if the genre is familiar, but now it's like, did someone hear it once? Did it ever exist in another format? Okay, great. Okay, good. I would put Under the Banner of Heaven, which looks like this sumptuous, pretty cool
it's Dustin Lance Black wrote it, and it's directed by David Mackenzie and Isabel Sandoval, but like it's, and it stars Garfield and Sam Worthington and Wyatt Russell. So I'm pretty excited about this. It looks like True Detective, honestly. Yeah,
it's Mormon. It's True Detective in Mormon in the world of the Mormon Church and in Utah, and like I'm on board. We just like that type of show, and that also doesn't feel particularly. I think it's true story, but I don't think you're a hypocrite because I don't think it's what we're speaking of in terms of like ripped from the headline / ripped from the podcast, because the frenzy with which things are being ripped from the headlines and podcast is such that I think next week Peacock is debuting a show they spent a lot of time and money on, Joe versus Carol, which is a scripted version of the Tiger King Joe Exotic story, which was a podcast and then a Netflix phenomenon. And then for a while, there were competing projects, right? It looked as if there would be 2 full television shows, one starring Nicolas Cage about this before that project blinked. And this is the one.
So that's a good, but one thing I wanted to mention, and this is something I wanted to ask you about because, and I think that what happens is sometimes when you have a feeling or a thought about one show that seems to be part of a movement of shows, that you then apply it to every show. So I don't necessarily want to tar every one of these with the same brush. I haven't seen every one of these yet, whether by screeners or whatever, but I've seen a few. And one thing that kind of I can't shake is the feeling of these shows being rushed. Now, that may not be entirely accurate factually in terms of, they sped through the production process and the development process and just rushed to get this to screens. Sometimes it's because they're based on, stories that have just recently happened that it feels like, wow, you really turned this around very quickly. Sometimes I think it does have to do with the competition within Hollywood for these stories where you've got multiple Elizabeth Holmes stories in production or in development. You've got multiple Tiger King stories in development.
And that's exactly the point I wanted to make, that as recently as like a year or two ago, the market sort of self-corrected and someone blinked and was like, we don't need 2 of these. That is over. There are 2 WeWork shows, right? Like coming. One is coming sooner than the other one. There are right now in production 2 just completely distinct shows about the same true crime murder story. One is called Candy and is filming in Atlanta with Jessica Biel and a bunch of Mad Men associated people involved, like Michael Uppendahl and Robin Veith, I believe, writing. And then HBO's doing that story also with Elizabeth Olsen and David Kelly, under the assumption that like people just love this stuff. And if it's HBO, if they get, I feel like HBO's with their swagger is just like, it doesn't matter if we get to market first, we're the HBO version.
Right.
But that's wild. Like that used to be significant, right? Like 2 Prefontaine biopics. Oh my goodness. Which by the way, is such a cute story now in retrospect.
I know.
2 movies about a long distance runner. But now we're just going to flood the zone with as many of them as we can because that does seem to be the growth industry. And I'm not sure if it's the right call.
And it's like I don't want to view everything through this lens, but I can't help but feel like it's almost like extremely online, like news savvy adults. It's their IP. It's like for somebody who spends a lot of time reading the Atlantic or the New Yorker or New York Times Magazine or whatever, this is your version of like the MCU where you can fantasize about who should play Elizabeth Holmes or Travis Kalanick or Carol Baskin or whatever. And there's like almost like a fantasy football element of like, this person would be perfect for this role. I can't wait to see this 7-episode series about this.
Or Jessica Pressler, who's now been played by Julia Stiles in the film Hustler, and Anna Klumsky in Inventing Anna. It's pretty wild.
Right.
I want to talk about Inventing Anna specifically, but the question I had for you about this topic, which, you know, to your point, like this is, we're just kind of, we're working with it here. This is a developing story. We have not seen all these shows. So we don't want to jump to any particular, you know, grandiose conclusions, but this is a podcast, and that is what the format is best at. So I was watching the trailer, another trailer that came out this week for the Apple TV Plus show Pachinko, which is a apparently sumptuous adaptation of the best-selling novel. Yeah. And first of all, it looks amazing. You've seen some of it, right? You're excited about it.
I cannot wait for people to see this show. I think it's wonderful.
Great cast, great, just great creative up and down the board. Very excited about that. I was watching it and I was thinking, this is interesting because a bestseller like Pachinko, which is about a Korean family's immigration from Korea to Japan over the course of the 20th century, you know, 20 years ago, a bestseller would get optioned. And 20 to, you know, anytime between 20 and 40, 50 years ago. But it would either die in the vine, or they would have to put more Americans in it, or they would film it in English, right? Or they would do all the things that Hollywood felt it needed to do for years. But thankfully, we're at a point now where a large book can be adapted into a large format miniseries, and also the book can be told in a manner that is respectful of and has fidelity to the source material. So it appears, and again, I haven't seen it, but the series is in Korean to a great extent, you know, with actors, whether they're Korean-born or Korean-American who speak the language. And that's kind of thrilling. And I was like, this is actually a positive reflection on something larger that was concerning me, which is our culture's not just obsession with verisimilitude, but what I was starting to wonder, and this is my big concern troll thought for the week, which is that I'm starting to worry that as a culture, we are becoming increasingly afraid of fiction and what that means. And the reason I say this, and there are a bunch of threads I'm going to throw at you, because we didn't prep for this. This is just an idea that occurred to me. But at the beginning of the show, we were talking about the Oscars and talking about how people were more comfortable with like deep diving into things. What Lost and Reddit did to the television show, right, which is just like real-time fact-checking everything, has become kind of a default internet pose that keeps us from actually engaging, often keeps many of us, or some of us, or straw men anyway, from engaging in what's being said creatively or emotionally, and keeps us one step removed, being like, well, that's not how police investigations work.
Right.
You know, or I don't believe that, or whatever. That never used to be the barrier for entry, right? Like when you go to see a play, you're not like, that's not how police investigations work. You're like, that man's standing in front of me pretending to be a policeman.
Right.
You buy into the fiction, and then you're there and present and living with the fiction. But we live in a moment, and I don't know how wide we cast this net, where like truth has been brought into question, like objective truth, and, you know, nothing is sourced and everything is destabilizing. But all of this is leading me to this place where I'm just like, I don't know if we're trusting audiences to buy make-believe anymore. We are either doing full make-believe, like Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, or we are doing fully sourced, you know, maybe fanciful, but sourced, like, you know, Wikipedia stuff, like Pam and Tommy, or We Crashed, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, you know, I think each one of those shows deserves to be evaluated on its own merit. So 100%. I'm nervous to like paint with a broad brush, but I would tweak your concern troll with maybe not fiction, but storytelling, you know. And if I read a magazine article about Uber or about Elizabeth Holmes or WeWork, some of those things I'm more interested in than others. I think generally speaking, I'm a little burned out on, and this seems stupid because it's like most stories are this, but I'm a little burned out on the torrid rise and precipitous fall of, you know, the new tech economy. But I think the most important part, it's like when you watch, say, Social Network, which I think is, if not the best, one of the best films of the century. I really could care less about whether or not that's the real story of how Facebook started, right? Like what I care about is that it feels true, and that the things that it's saying about greed and about our capacity to kind of cannibalize ourselves for the sake of power, or the things that we do to see our visions executed. That's what's important to me. Also, it's a David Fincher movie and it looks really good, and it's an Aaron Sorkin written script, so it sounds really good, and the music's cool, and like all the elements of filmic storytelling are in full flight there. And so when it's just simply, hey, like, here's this show based on widely understood information about whether it's a con artist or a CEO, and we're pretty much going to shoot it like kind of a glorified reality show or a glorified documentary, but the joy of Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Travis Kalanick or Amanda Seyfried as Elizabeth Holmes is about as deep as this pebble goes into the water. I don't know. I think that's the issue that I'm having, more than it being whether or not like we're too over reliant on like reality, on fiction or nonfiction.
I just think reality gives the creators and the audience banisters, safety guardrails, to not let things get too out of hand or get too uncomfortable or too surprising. And I think it can work out really well. I mean, we're going to be talking about the new Winning Time, the Lakers show on HBO soon. And, that's telling a true story. It's, embellishing and having some very Adam McKay-like fun with it. And it's super entertaining. Like, I've only seen one, but I'm into it. But I'm going to continue to beat the drum for the idea that I would rather watch Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master than a 10-hour miniseries about L. Ron Hubbard. You know what I mean? Like, I want an artist to be inspired by something and tell us a story that has its own meaning and stakes. I mean, like Chinatown, for example, like Jake Gittes doesn't exist. He didn't exist, but he could have, and that world kind of did, and it had something to say about history, but also about the moment in American history when the movie was actually made, right? And I feel like that ability to let artists play in a sandbox, kind of, sorta, inspired by something, I think we're losing that, because I think people, whether it's hopefully we're trying to not make too broad, not paint with too broad a brush, because I think that there is reticence and fear on the part of Hollywood and executives, which is also legitimate because people don't want to lose their jobs. But I also think there's reticence and fear on the part of audiences too. And I think both groups are assuming kind of the worst about the other, and we're inching forward with our hands covering our eyes a little bit into this era, which it makes me worried about the art we're going to be seeing, or at least the opportunity for the really challenging or inspiring art or surprising art to get made.
Now, I say all this stuff about I don't care about reality. I just want it to feel true, or I don't care about whether it's accurate. I just want it to feel true. But I think that was probably not the case for Inventing Anna for me, which I didn't like in general from what I've seen of it. And, like, part of the reason why I didn't like it was, I think maybe the best way to say it is just like the tone of it was just like at a pitch that I wasn't really into. But another reason why I didn't like it is that I felt like a lot of the stuff that felt grafted onto it to make it more TV felt like completely unnecessary from what would have been just a compelling story. What did you make of the episodes that you saw?
I am of two minds. So I've seen 2 episodes, and I have been told that, boy, it gets better when they get to Morocco. But we're always told that there's a Morocco episode, even if it's not literally the case, right? With these, especially these streaming shows that drop all their episodes, like maybe it does get better. But there are a lot of episodes, and they're long, and so I don't think I'm going to make it to Morocco, sadly. I'm of two minds about it. One is that I want to begin by saying Shonda Rhimes is the best there is at what she does, and it's actually kind of notable and respectable, more than respectable. Just, it's noteworthy, I think, that this potentially hot property to be optioned, reality, actual thing, like from an article, as we mentioned in New York Magazine, about a kind of a grifter who penetrated the halls of the upper echelon of New York society and money, was given to someone who made a very specific version of it in their métier. You know what I mean? Like, kind of like giving Star Trek to Quentin Tarantino. What comes out is going to end up being a lot more Tarantino than Star Trek, probably, which is why Paramount blinked. This ends up being a Shonda Rhimes show, which is a very successful formula, and there aren't that many auteurs who, when they take something, make it their own. All of that said, I can't get over this show because to me, and I do not know better than Shonda Rhimes. I am not worthy of being said in the same sentence as Shonda Rhimes in terms of what I know about TV, let alone making TV. But a kind of sexy New York socialite grifter in the Instagram age seems pretty fun and poppy to me. And for it to become what is essentially a Shonda Rhimes show in that it is a very soapy, earnest dramedy about work and process boggles my mind.
Right.
You have this super cuckoo bananas Julia Garner performance at the heart of the show as the person that makes everything go. And you begin with her already arrested and then kind of make the show about Anna Klumsky's dogged reporter who, you know, is also an avatar for strident Me Too era feminism in the workplace. And then also Arian Moayed, whom we love on Succession and want to see succeed everywhere, is a defense attorney. And then he just gets like a 6-minute ISO play called for him where he's just like, I grew up poor.
Yeah.
Like it's wild. But this is what she makes. But this is not the show that I would have wanted personally, which is not to say I'm right because it's top 10 Netflix around the world. So it worked. But I'm just like incredulous about the way the show plays out. And the way
I was thinking about this a lot because I super enjoy newsroom set dramas and comedies. I think it's in a really right place to tell a story. You know, I know a little bit about New York Magazine, and Jessica Pressler has been really open about the changes that they made to it and has honestly a fantastic attitude about, you know, she's just like, there's just stuff that they do for TV that's not going to be like exactly what it was like at Varick Street,
like,
you know?
Like also like not painting her baby's nursery, instead putting up like clues and facts for her story there.
But exactly what you're saying, telling the story from the perspective of telling the story rather than the story happening is a really interesting storytelling choice that I just didn't love. I also just thought, like, for me, Anna Chlumsky's performance was just kind of like dialed in at like a really like weird vibe, you know, like I guess like your mileage may vary on that, but for that to be essentially the lead, and I like her a lot generally, like she's just incredible on Veep. I just would say like that threw me off and grated a little bit.
I like her in this because she strikes me, the way she takes this material just feels like, you know, someone being handed a power bar after a marathon. Like she just seems like hungry for this,
right?
You know, and is going to act the shit out of it, even when the scenes are frankly like jaw dropping, when like her character confronts someone who like knew in the service industry who knew Anna, and she's just like, then gets a monologue about the way people behave in New York. Like it's just, the telling the story about the story is just so odd to me, because there's a moment in the end of the second, near the end of the second episode. And I imagine there's more of this going forward as we learn more about Anna's life in flashback, where kind of her bluff gets called, right? And she doesn't have another credit card, and it's an increasingly tense situation, and maybe the bottom's going to fall out and she's going to be discovered. And Garner, who is, accent aside, is just, you know, I think is a great, great, great actor, is doing it. And you're getting that kind of like queasy, sick feeling, you know, that even though you are not hopefully yourself a grifter, but like you're having some common humanity in that moment. And I'm like, isn't that the story? Mm-hmm. Instead of then flashing back to Anna Chlumsky interviewing her, that Anna Delvey's then fashionista friend, with him being like, it was tough to see that. Okay.
Right.
But like, put us in there with it. Like, why is it about process? It's really interesting, but that's why I kind of started this by saying, I don't know if I can credibly be like, we're losing the personalized aesthetic touch of filmmakers in this era of straight to screen, and then being like, this powerful auteur who put her unmistakable stamp on a story chose the wrong stamp. Like that feels a little.
I also don't need every show to be like gorgeous magic hour shots of people touching wheat. You know, like I've got 1883 for that. It doesn't need to be that in every series. I think I just found,
is touching wheat what you call drinking your non-alcoholic beers that you were talking about the other week?
I feel like we should end the podcast. I don't think it's going to get even better than that.
5 p.m. Time to touch wheat. Not going to get a buzz.
I wanted to ask you though. Do you think you will watch Super Pumped, or is that kind of story? Because I would not call a Super Pumped depiction of Kalanick empathetic. I mean, it's, I guess, empathetic in the sense that it's like finding humanity in all of the characters, but I wouldn't necessarily call it. It's not like they're trying to say like Travis was this great guy who just like collapsed under pressure. But it is an interesting rendering of this story because, at least in the episodes that I've seen so far, you don't find out why he becomes Batman really. Like there are some suggestions like, oh, he had a problem with his brother or whatever, but like there's not like an origin story. He's just like, I'm trying to fucking take over the world. And then, we know what happens to him. He didn't work. I mean, for Uber it worked, but not for him.
It's like he did, right?
Yeah.
Is that the end of the story?
Yeah.
I will say I don't, and I'm curious how much of our audience I speak for in this. I kind of want TV shows. I will check out Super Pump because, like you said, like Koppelman and Levine are like worthwhile, smart, interesting guys, and they have something to say, and they're making another season of this. So like this is something that they want to work. This is a lane they want to work in, So I think that's interesting. Like these guys who have really, are masters of the kind of the bro code, basically, like looking at the toxicity of the way that's played out in the tech space or in our economy. Like, okay, that's cool. That's a project that's worthwhile. I am not diminishing that. But personally, I kind of want to watch TV shows again on TV.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really want 8-hour events at the moment about things that happened in the news or, dramatic recreations of magazine articles. I don't want that. If I wanted something limited that's investigating a feeling or an idea or a crime, I'll watch a movie.
Yeah.
Right now. That's where I'm at. Like, I think that, John Landgraf 10 years ago identified this area, this 6 to 10 hour spot as like a really sweet one and an underutilized asset. But I feel like we've gone the other direction. Like I was looking at our list of stuff that we're looking forward to in the watch, like shows coming back or not shows coming back, just shows premiering. And I'm desperately looking, there are a lot of cool things, but I'm looking for the ones that are shows coming back.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see my pals again. I can't wait to get back to Atlanta. Like I wish Succession would come back sooner.
Saul. Yeah.
I can't wait for Saul for that reason. Thank you. That was on the tip of my tongue. That's the show that I want to come back. The rhythmic experience of being like, okay, firing this one up. Like, yeah. I'm personally growing weary of that too. And so that alone, not that I am representative of the average TV viewer necessarily, but I think that feeling makes me think that we might actually be closer to the end of this era of like 3D printer versions of reality than it seems. This was a moment in Hollywood grabbing this stuff up, and now as they come out...
And it just so happens that it's all coming out at the same 3 months per stretch.
Potentially because of COVID or whatever, but I have a feeling that the people who are making the decisions have... I mean, obviously, podcasts are still getting gobbled up and bought, but I think we may be moving off of this.
Just in time for us to sell our podcast as a straight rip from the headlines story.
About me doing Wordle in the mornings?
Andy, we will be back on Monday. We have a very special guest on Monday. It is a Righteous Gems pod. I will say that. So get caught up on the second season of Righteous Gemstones if you haven't. Andy did. We will be back on Monday, and fun stuff coming up. As Andy mentioned, there's a lot of good shows coming up, plus Top Chef's coming back next week. So I don't know that we're going to be dedicating like our entire second episode of the weeks to Top Chef, but we'll definitely be talking about it a lot and talking about most episodes. So stay tuned for that.
I will be dedicating my second episode to it, but at a certain point, they might cut my mic.
On the Patreon. Thanks to Kai McMullen for producing us. We'll be back next week.
Patreon. On the Substack.